What would happen to the US economy if the dollar was no longer the world reserve currency? I'm going to explain this to you in 3 simple, fast steps. And we're right here in my hotel room in beautiful St. Bart's. So I'm going to have to keep it down to a loud whisper, but we're going to do the best with what we've got. Step number 1. We're going to go over production, consumption, and the trade deficit. It's super important you get your mind around how this works so you can put all the pieces of the puzzle together. We have 2 countries, 1, 2, 3, and USA. Corey is in country 1, 2, 3, and he produces a lot of cotton, more than he consumes. That's key. And Randall produces cattle. Every single year, Randall and his family consume 1 cow. So he's got an additional cow that he can sell to Corey, who isn't very good at growing cattle at all. And Corey gives him $100, and then Randall, who isn't very good at growing cotton, can take the $100, give it right back to Corey, and then he gets the cotton that he needs. So both individuals, Randall and Corey, have the cotton and the beef they need for the entire year. It's a win-win. They started the year with $500 each, and at the end of the year, they have the $500 and they have the supplies they need. But over time, Randall starts to get lazy. He says, listen, I have been working my fingers to the bone 12 hours a day growing these cattle. Life is too short. I only need 1 cow a year, so I'm gonna only work 6 months, and I'm gonna start going to the beaches of Bali for the other 6 months, vacationing, traveling, starting an Instagram account, and really enjoying my life. But I still need the cotton, but I've got this $500 in savings, so every single year, I'll just deplete my savings a little by continuing to give Corey the $100, and then he'll still give me that cotton because he's still producing more than he consumes. So after year 1, Corey's got $600. Randall only has $400. So what's happening is Corey's getting richer, Randall is getting poorer. At the end of 5 years, Corey has $1,000, but Randall is flat broke. He has $0 in the bank. And then your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam comes along and says, Randall, don't you worry. We're the richest country in the world. You shouldn't have to work so hard. Plus, all these countries outside of the United States do business in dollars. So there's this artificial demand for dollars. So what we can do is we can sell Corey an IOU for $100. And all you have to do is vote for me next year, and I'll give you that $100. We'll just call it UBI or additional unemployment or stimulus, something like that. But I'll give you the $100 so you can get the cotton you need, and you can still hang out on the beaches of Bali 6 months a year. So Randall says, okay, well, that's fine for right now. But for whatever reason, over time, Randall starts to get pissed. He's looking at Corey and saying, darn it, that capitalist. I hate the fact that he's producing more than he consumes and he's getting richer while I'm getting poor. It's just not fair. I need to fight this capitalist oppression. So Randall goes from being a cattle farmer to being Randall the rioter. He's out there on the street protesting every day, looting businesses, starting fires, just causing problems. So your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam comes in and says, whoa, 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 Randall, I know, life isn't fair. Let's do this. I'll issue an IOU for another $100 to this country XYZ that just happens to be producing more cows than they consume. And instead of giving you $100 a year, I'll give you $200 a year. So now you don't have to work at all. Let's think through what's happening. Randall is taking the money and giving it right to the country that produces more than they consume. They're giving the goods to Randall, but they're taking the exact same money and lending it right back to the government so they can go and buy more votes. What ends up happening over the long term is this country's assets go up and up and up, while the debt of the government goes through the roof. This is how the United States trade deficit works. And it's why people like Peter Schiff and Lynn Alden always say the United States is going into debt to consume. Step number 2. Now let's take a deep dive into how the United States overconsumes as a result of having the world reserve currency. And then we're going to take what we've learned in step number 1 and 2 and connect all the dots in step number 3 so we can answer the question, what would happen to the US economy if the dollar was no longer the reserve currency? So in step number 1, we went over how the United States is able to consume more than it produces and how this creates a trade deficit. And we can sustain that for a long time while interest rates are artificially low and the value of the dollar is artificially high. In other words, if another country tried to do the same thing and run long-term trade deficits, their currency would have the tendency to go down in value and their interest rates would have the tendency to go up. But going into this deep dive, we can safely assume that regardless of what the rates are in the United States and what they have been for the past 40 years since we've been on an interest rate down cycle, we can safely assume that the rates are lower than they otherwise would have been if the United States didn't have the reserve currency. Let's think through the knock-on effects. First, stock prices have a lot more tailwinds. So they go up, people's 401ks get bigger and bigger and bigger. This produces something I call NPPP, or non-produced purchasing power. Let me give an example of what I'm referring to. Got an average Joe, works a 9-to-5 gig, saves up 10 grand, puts it into the stock market in some of these high-flying stocks like Tesla, Netflix, Amazon. His $10,000 grows to $100,000. Well, he hasn't worked an extra hour, hasn't produced any more goods or services, but now he has an additional $90,000 worth of purchasing power. And let's remember that the stock market has nothing to do with the economy. Back in the old days, you could have argued, yes, but the stock price went up because someone in the domestic economy produced more goods and services. But now that's completely removed. The stock market almost has an inverse relationship with the real economy. The worse the real economy does, the less it produces, the higher the stock market goes because of all the funny money the Fed has printed and all the excess liquidity flowing into the stock market. It has nothing to do with fundamentals. It has everything to do with liquidity. But the bottom line is the stock market goes up artificially. This produces additional purchasing power. And because we have these artificially low rates, we have cheaper loans, such as mortgages. So this means the home prices go up as well, just like the stock market did, producing more NPPP. Oh, but wait, there is more. It also produces lower costs of borrowing for all of these businesses, like Topgolf, Home Depot, and Target. They can build more stores, get more inventory, hire more people, create more jobs as a result of lower borrowing costs, which is a result of the dollar being the world reserve currency. And this status translates to additional demand for the currency units outside of the US domestic economy. And this means the dollar is overvalued against other currencies. So when we're bringing in all those imports that create the trade deficit we talked about in step number 1, we're bringing in those goods a lot cheaper than we otherwise would. So when they hit the shelves of Home Depot and Target, which are two of the largest importers from China, all the people that have the jobs that work at Home Depot, Target, Topgolf, and all the people that have additional purchasing power, non-produced purchasing power, get the goods that they buy at all these big box stores a lot cheaper, which increases their ability to consume. So as a result of the United States having what a lot of economists have referred to as this exorbitant privilege, we have more Home Depots, more Targets, and we have something called Topgolf, which, let's be honest, there's no way that thing would exist if we didn't have the world reserve currency. That is for sure. That thing would definitely be bust. But we also have a lot more consumption. We have people in the real economy like Amy and Mike that actually have jobs as a result, and they can afford to hire people like Stu to drive them around. And we have rich and rich who are getting more rich even though they're not working any additional hours or producing any more goods or services. And on the topic of NPPP, let's also remember we've got Corey that's in country 1, 2, 3 that's accumulating all of these dollars. In step number 1, we talked about him just buying treasuries, but he's also buying stocks and he's buying U.S. real estate with all those additional dollars that he's accumulating. So this increases asset prices even further, which gives people like Rich and Rich even more non-produced purchasing power, which also leads to social unrest because it increases the divide between these individuals who own assets and these individuals who are just typical workers in the economy. I'm not saying that if the United States didn't have the world reserve currency, that it would be some third world country. But I am saying that San Diego would look a hell of a lot more like Tijuana. And let's remember that when the United States gained this status, we had the most gold in the world. And we earned that gold by producing more stuff than everybody else. It's just we've been riding on the coattails of what our grandparents did for the last 40 years. But sooner or later, this has got to come to an end. Step number 3, the end game. And now it's officially stiff drink time for sure. But not just stiff drink time today. It's St. Bart's stiff drink time right here from my hotel room. That's right. So in step number 1, we discussed how the United States is able to overconsume, underproduce, and how they've had this trade deficit for a long time. Step number 2, on a local level, how this affects the everyday person like you and me. It drives rates down, creates cheaper debt, higher asset prices. The dollar value is artificially high. This creates cheaper goods for these imports we're bringing in from other countries. And it allows us to overconsume. Most likely for the last 40 years, since the early 1980s, when we've been in this down cycle of interest rates. But to really connect the dots to answer the question, what would happen to the US economy if the dollar was no longer the reserve currency? We have to really understand how it typically works between two countries when they trade back and forth. So let's say this was the old school USA, where we actually had a manufacturing base to our economy. Country XYZ. If country XYZ is producing stuff more efficiently, they're going to export more things to the United States. We import their goods because we can get them cheaper. It makes a lot of sense. It's better for our consumers, and we're exporting fewer goods to them. Well, this creates less demand for the dollar, so the dollar goes down in value against XYZ's currency. This, over the long term, gives the United States a competitive advantage because it makes their manufacturing goods cheaper for the consumers in XYZ to buy. So in the next 5 years, 7 years, 3 years maybe, the US starts to export more stuff to this country. They export fewer things, and the dollar appreciates in value. There's more demand for dollars as a result. I don't want to go into why that happens. I've done several whiteboard videos on that. So today we're going to take that as face value. The main takeaway is whichever country is exporting more stuff, they're going to have more tailwind to the value of their currency. But now what has happened since the dollar has been the world reserve currency for so long, it's created structural issues in the United States. Our economy doesn't look like this anymore, where we have a significant manufacturing base and we have services in our economy. Now we barely produce anything, and the services are almost the entire economy, especially when you include government spending. So we can't produce the goods necessary to send to another country to actually increase the value of the dollar if it was falling too fast because of these structural issues we talked about. So what happens is the dollar goes down faster and faster and faster if it were to lose reserve currency status. This creates more expensive goods because we have to import all these things from other countries that allow us to consume. And as the dollar goes down in value, those imports get more and more expensive. So our standard of living goes down further and further and further. But you say, George, the government would come in and start spending, especially in today's environment where the Republicans and the Democrats, whether you're on the left or right, the one thing they all favor is more government spending. The problem with this is it creates all these high deficits or higher and higher deficits. If you look at the deficit as a percentage of GDP prior to the cerveza sickness, it was over 5%. We have never seen levels that high unless we were in a recession. And you hear on Fox News or Trump's Twitter feed, it's the greatest economy in the history of mankind. I don't think so. So what happens to the deficits now? Who's going to buy the treasuries that would allow the government to spend even more money to fill the gap that's been created in consumption by consumer goods rising in price while we're having this deglobalization and all these supply chains trying to come back to the United States? Trying is the key word. Editor, go ahead and throw up a chart of government spending so we can really get our minds around this. As we can see, currently government spending is 50% or almost 50% of GDP, but this chart was prior to the cerveza sickness. So I think it's safe to conclude that now government spending is over 50% of GDP. Let that sink in for a moment. That means that over half of our economy is a result of the government, not the private sector. And right about now, your friend and family member Fred would step in and said, "Oh, George is just fear-mongering. That's nonsense. The foreigners will always buy our debt. There will always be a bid for treasuries." Not so fast. Editor, go ahead and throw up the chart so we can see who is currently buying the treasuries. And look at what has happened. The amount of purchasing from the foreigners has really leveled off, but the Fed buying has gone parabolic. So what this is telling us is all this additional debt the government is issuing by running these huge budget deficits is being purchased by the Fed. So they're just printing up funny money and giving it directly to the government. We call that monetizing the debt. Yes, that is what they do in banana republics. If another country or central bank tried to do what we're doing, their currency would just plummet. And you ask, well, why hasn't that happened in Japan? Why hasn't it happened in Europe? Because they produce stuff. So they export things to other countries, which creates demand for their currency. Now, I'm not saying their economies are great. Their economies are just as bad, if not worse structurally than ours, but it's a much different type of problem they have. So really the bottom line here is the end game is pretty much the opposite of what we discussed in step number 2. Rates will go up. This means more expensive debt, lower asset prices. The dollar goes down in value, which makes the goods that we buy more and more expensive. This means we have to underconsume as much as we have overconsumed for the past 40 years until we're able to build back that manufacturing base so we can actually start selling goods to other countries like we would have back in this original example of two countries without the reserve currency. The problem there is if we look at China as an example, it took them 20 years to build this manufacturing base that we need and that we've lost over the past 50, 60 years. So if it took them 20 years, how long is it going to take the United States? Now, I would argue from an entrepreneurship standpoint, we have a huge edge, but we're going to see a ton of government regulations coming down the pipeline, especially if government spending is already at 50+%, and all of these assets from the private sector are going onto the Fed's balance sheet. We're going to have less and less free market capitalism, which means getting back to this point with our manufacturing is going to be harder and harder on a moving forward basis. And let's not forget that consumption is 70% of our economy. So if we have to underconsume for 10 to 20 years, what is that going to do to the standard of living that we've enjoyed as Americans? I'd like to point out my most recent interview with Jim Bianco, where he told us that the GFC, the amount of carnage we felt during the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009 was a result of economic output in the United States going down by 6%. 6%. So think about how much economic output would go down if we had to underconsume and the economy is 70% consumption. It's not unrealistic to think that for a long period of time, our economic output would be at only 75%. And that doesn't sound that bad unless you think about it through the lens of what Jim Bianco was talking about. He not only discussed the GFC, but he also discussed the Great Depression of the 1930s, where economic output went down by, you guessed it, 25%. So I'm not saying that the United States would have a deflationary depression if they no longer had the world reserve currency. But what I am saying is, although there's no certainties, I think the probabilities would be high that we'd experience stagflation for a long, long time.
For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here, and I will see you on the next video.